Tony had always been the silent type. In 12 years running his auto shop, he'd maybe said 1,000 words to customers total. Just yep, nope, and that'll be $47.50. But when 3 armed men burst through his door demanding cash, Tony finally had something worth saying. "Gentlemen, you've made a serious tactical error. Welcome to the human stories. Have you ever met someone who speaks very little, yet when they do, their words carry tremendous weight?" Today's story is about Tony Martinez, a quiet mechanic whose silence hit a warrior's heart. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? And have you ever underestimated someone based on their quiet demeanor? Tony Martinez had always been the silent type, but his silence wasn't born from shyness or awkwardness. It was the calculated quiet of a man who'd learned that words could be weapons, and weapons should only be drawn when absolutely necessary. For 12 years, he'd run Tony's Auto Repair on the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but still held on to its working-class pride. The shop itself was a testament to Tony's character, meticulously organized, spotlessly clean despite the nature of the work, and filled with tools maintained with almost military precision. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, Tony would unlock the heavy steel door and flip the hand-painted sign from closed to open. His routine never varied. Check the oil levels in the hydraulic lifts, organize the day's work orders, and brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He'd learned to make coffee that way in the Marines, thick, black, and capable of keeping you alert through 8-hour shifts. His customers were mostly locals, who'd been coming to him for years. Mrs. Rodriguez with her ancient Honda Civic that somehow kept running through Tony's careful ministrations. Big Mike from the construction crew, who brought his work truck in every month like clockwork. Sarah Chun, the high school teacher who trusted Tony with her father's vintage Mustang Dot to all of them. Tony was simply the guy who fixed cars and didn't talk much. They knew he was reliable, honest, and fair with his pricing. What they didn't know was that those grease-stained hands had once defused improvised explosive devices in the streets of Fallujah. Yep, he'd say when Mrs. Rodriguez asked if her transmission would last another year. Nope, he'd respond when Big Mike wondered if he could skip the brake inspection. That'll be $47.50, became his most common phrase, delivered with a slight nod and the hint of a smile that never quite reached his eyes. In a neighborhood where small businesses struggled to survive, where crime rates had been steadily climbing, Tony's quiet competence had made his shop a sanctuary. People trusted him not just with their vehicles, but with their stories, their worries, their small talk that he absorbed without judgment. Before the grease-stained coveralls and the smell of motor oil, Tony Martinez had been Staff Sergeant Antonio Martinez, United States Marine Corps' 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion. The transition from explosives to engine repairs wasn't as strange as it might seem. Both required patience, precision, and the ability to understand complex systems under pressure. His first deployment to Iraq had been in 2006, when the insurgency was at its deadliest and every road could hide an IED capable of turning an armored vehicle into twisted metal. As a combat engineer, Tony's job was route clearance, going out ahead of supply convoys to find and neutralize the bombs before they could claim American lives. The work required steady hands and nerves of steel. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and you wouldn't just die. You'd take your team with you. Tony had learned to shut out everything except the task at hand, the delicate work of rendering safe devices designed to kill. His second deployment in 2008 had been different. By then, he was training younger Marines, passing on knowledge that could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a flag-draped coffin. He'd saved countless lives over those 24 months, earning a Bronze Star and the Thumb. Quiet respect of men who knew what real courage looked like. But combat changes you. The hypervigilance that keeps you alive in a war zone doesn't switch off when you come home. The ability to assess threats, to notice details others miss, to remain calm under pressure, these became part of Tony's DNA. When Tony left the Marines in 2009, he'd used his GI Bill benefits to learn automotive repair, drawn to work that let him use his hands without having to explain his past. The auto shop became his new mission, his purpose. Every engine he rebuilt was a small victory. Every satisfied customer was proof that he could still contribute something positive to the world. The Riverside district where Tony's shop was located had character, but it also had problems. What had once been a thriving blue-collar neighborhood was slowly being squeezed by economic pressures. Young families were moving to the suburbs. Older residents were struggling with fixed incomes, and empty storefronts were attracting the wrong kind of attention. Tony's shop had been broken into twice in the past 18 months. The first time, they'd taken his expensive diagnostic computer and about $300 from the register. The second time, they just trashed the place, spray painting gang tags on his tool boards and smashing windows for the apparent fun of it. Both times, Tony had cleaned up, replaced what needed replacing, and gotten back to work. The police had been sympathetic but realistic, with limited resources and bigger crimes to investigate. The theft of automotive tools wasn't exactly a priority. The other business owners on the block had formed an informal network, watching out for each other when possible. Maria Santos ran the corner market 3 buildings down, a tiny woman with fierce determination who'd immigrated from El Salvador 30 years earlier. Frank Kowalski owned the barbershop next door, a Vietnam veteran who cut hair the way he'd learned in the Army. These were Tony's people, hardworking, honest, and stubborn enough to stay in a neighborhood that others had written off. They looked out for each other in small ways, accepting packages when someone was away, calling if they noticed anything suspicious, sharing information about customers who paid with bad checks. But the crime was getting bolder. Last month, Maria's market had been robbed at gunpoint. The month before that, Frank's barbershop had been hit by kids who'd stolen his antique cash register. Tony never attended the neighborhood watch meetings that Maria tried to organize, but he was always aware of what was happening around him. His military training had taught him to observe, to analyze, to prepare. He knew which cars belonged and which didn't. He knew the rhythm of normal activity and could sense when something was off. Most importantly, he knew that eventually his turn would come. Thursday, November 15th, 8:47 p.m. Tony could remember the exact time because he'd been checking the wall clock when he heard the back door splinter. He'd been working late on Sarah Chun's Mustang, a carburetor rebuild that was coming together beautifully. The shop was quiet, except for soft rock, playing on his ancient radio. Tony had sent his part-time helper, Miguel, home at 6 o'clock. The front door was locked, the closed sign clearly visible, and the garage bays were sealed tight. The sound of splintering wood cut through the radio static like a gunshot. Tony's body reacted before his mind caught up. 12 years of civilian life disappearing as his Marine training took over. He set down his wrench with deliberate care, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and moved toward the sound. 3 men had forced their way through the rear entrance, their faces covered with bandanas and their voices artificially aggressive. "Empty the register," shouted the tallest one, a lanky kid who couldn't have been more than 25, waving a chrome-plated pistol with the loose grip of someone who'd watched too many movies. The other 2 spread out, trying to look professional, but moving with clumsy coordination. One carried a sawed-off baseball bat. The other had a knife that he kept switching from hand to hand. Nervous energy that told Tony everything he needed to know about their experience level. Tony stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his expression calm. The robbers had expected fear, pleading immediate compliance. What they got instead was silence that stretched uncomfortably long. "Did you hear me, old man?" the leader demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Open the register, or we'll beat." "You bloody." Tony looked at each of them in turn, his eyes taking in details. The leader's weak grip on his weapon, the second man's obvious drug withdrawal symptoms, the third one's constantly shifting weight that suggested he was ready to run. "Gentlemen," Tony said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd given orders in life-or-death situations, "you've made a serious tactical error." The simple statement hung in the air like smoke. The robbers exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their aggressive postures. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but Tony's training allowed him to process every detail with crystal clarity. The leader's gun hand wavered as confusion replaced aggression. In that moment of hesitation, Tony moved. His right hand swept up from behind the counter, grabbing a 2-pound ball-peen hammer. His left hand found the handle of a torque wrench, 40 inches of precision-balanced steel. The first robber lunged forward, but Tony had already read his movement. The hammer caught the gun hand with surgical precision, hard enough to numb the fingers and send the pistol spinning away, not hard enough to cause permanent damage. The second attacker swung his baseball bat in a wild arc, but Tony had pivoted, letting the bat whistle past his ear while the torque wrench swept low, catching the man behind the knee and dropping him to the concrete floor. The third robber, seeing his partners down and realizing the easy target had become a nightmare. Scenario: turn to run. Tony let him take 3 steps before speaking again. "Stop." The single word carried such quiet authority that the fleeing man actually obeyed. "Turn around." Slowly. The man complied, his face pale above his makeshift mask. Tony moved efficiently, using zip ties from his parts inventory to secure the 2 injured robbers. Neither was seriously hurt. Tony's strikes had been precisely calibrated to disable without causing lasting damage. The leader clutched his numb hand, staring at Tony with new understanding. "You're military." "Was," Tony corrected, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Now I'm just a mechanic who wants to close his shop and go home." He dialed 911 with the same calm efficiency he'd used to disarm them. "This is Tony Martinez at Tony's Auto Repair, 1247 Maple Street. 3 armed men attempted a robbery. Suspects are restrained and require medical attention for minor injuries. Please send units and an ambulance." The police arrived in force. 6 units responding to what dispatch had coded as an armed robbery in progress. Officer Janet Kim was the first through the door. She found Tony sitting calmly on a work stool. The 3 would-be robbers zip-tied and sitting against the wall like scolded children. The leader's gun was in a clear plastic bag on the counter. "Mr. Martinez, are you injured?" "No, ma'am." "Minor scuffle, but everyone's intact." Officer Kim looked at the scene, taking in the professional way the suspects had been restrained, the careful handling of evidence, the complete lack of unnecessary damage. "Sir, what's your background?" "Marines. Combat engineer. 2 tours, Iraq." That explained everything. Kim had worked enough cases involving veterans to know that military training didn't just disappear, but she'd never seen such textbook crowd control from a civilian dot as the robbers were loaded into patrol cars. The leader looked back at Tony. "How'd? You know we weren't serious?" Tony considered the question as he locked up his tools. "Your stance was wrong. Your grip was wrong. Your timing was wrong. And you talked too much. We had guns. You had a gun. Singular, safety was on, and you held it like it was going to bite you." Tony's voice carried no mockery, just professional assessment. "Next time you want easy money, try the lottery." Word of the incident spread through the neighborhood faster than Tony could have imagined. By the time he opened shop the next morning, A small crowd had gathered outside his door. Maria, from the corner market, brought homemade tamales. Frank from the barber shop offered to organize a neighborhood watch with Tony as coordinator. Sarah Chun stopped by with her students, wanting to thank the man who'd proven that courage came in quiet packages. "Mr. Tony," said Miguel, his young assistant, "my cousin wants to know if you're teaching self-defense classes." Tony shook his head. "I fix cars, Miguel. That's what I do." But the requests kept coming. Other business owners wanted security advice. Parents asked if he'd talk to their teenage sons about discipline and responsibility. Veterans began stopping. By just to shake his hand, the local newspaper ran a small story. "Local Marine veteran stops armed robbery." The TV news picked it up. Social media turned it into something larger. "Silent hero shows true courage." Tony hated the attention, but he noticed changes in the neighborhood. People walked with more confidence. Other business owners invested in better security. The informal network of mutual support grew stronger. Most importantly, crime in the area dropped noticeably. Word had spread that the quiet mechanic on Maple Street was not what he appeared to be. 3 months after the incident, Tony's routine had mostly returned to normal. The media attention had faded, and he was back to his comfortable pattern of, "Yep, nope, and that'll be $47.50. But small changes remained. A Marine Corps flag now hung in the shop's front window, not as advertisement, but as acknowledgement. A plaque from the Neighborhood Business Association sat on his desk. Most significantly, Tony had begun talking more. Not much. He'd never be a chatterbox, but enough to connect with his customers and neighbors in ways he hadn't allowed himself before. "You know," said Mrs. Rodriguez one afternoon, "I always wondered why you were so calm about everything. Now I understand." "What's that?" Tony asked. "You've seen worse than broken transmissions and overdue bills." Tony nodded. "Everyone's fighting some kind of battle. Mine's just more obvious now." The truth was, the incident had changed him. For years, he'd carried his military service like a burden. Now he understood that his skills and experience were gifts that could serve his community in peacetime, just as they had served his country in war. He'd started attending Maria's neighborhood watch meetings. He'd agreed to speak at Miguel's son's career day. He'd even begun considering self-defense classes for local business owners. Tony Martinez was still the silent type, but his silence now carried the weight of respect earned and trust built. His few words carried authority because people knew they came from genuine strength and hard-won wisdom. 1 year later, Tony's auto repair looked much the same as it always had. The tools were still organized with military precision. The work was still done with careful attention to detail, but the shop had become something more than a business. It was a symbol of what one person could accomplish through quiet competence and moral courage. Tony still didn't use many words, but the ones he chose carried weight. When he said, "That'll be $47.50, customers heard more than a price. They heard the voice of a man who stood for something. And sometimes, in a world full of noise and bluster, the most powerful voice is the one that speaks only when it has something important to say. If this story moved you, subscribe to The Human Stories for more narratives about everyday heroes whose quiet strength makes communities stronger. What city are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed someone's true character emerge in a crisis? Share your story in the comments below.